June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea. The sun was barely up over the Philippine Sea, but the sky was already alive with motion. Engines roared, wings flexed, and propellers carved shimmering halos into the morning haze. Aboard the USS Lexington, CV-16 Flight Lieutenant Alex Vraciu adjusted his oxygen mask, his gloved hand tightening on the stick of his F-6F Hellcat. Below him, the carrier deck was chaos crews in yellow shirts waving paddles, ordnance men sprinting between planes, the acrid smell of aviation fuel mixing with salt and steel. The air was thick with urgency. Radar had just detected hundreds of incoming bogies. The Japanese had finally come. Hellcats form up, Angels, 20, let's clean house, came the order crackling through the headset. Vraciu flipped his safety off. The twin 50 caliber Brownings under his wings were ready. His squadron VF-16 rolled off the deck one by one, engines screaming as they climbed into the blinding morning light. He leveled off at 20,000 feet and saw them. To the west, glinting against the sun, came wave after wave of Japanese aircraft, A6M-0s, D4Y Judys, and B6N Jills, hundreds of them forming a black tide against the horizon. It was Operation Ago, Japan's desperate attempt to destroy the U.S. invasion fleet off the Marianas. Mother of God, someone muttered over the radio. There must be 300 of them. Then let's make this quick, Vraciu replied. He shoved the throttle forward. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roared like thunder, the Hellcat surging ahead. The American fighter was heavier, slower in a climb, but it could take punishment, and its guns bit harder than anything Japan had left. Radar operators aboard the USS Enterprise began counting the dots. 100 miles out, then 80, then 60. Raid 1 inbound. All cap units intercept. On every American carrier in Task Force 58, alarms blared. Sailors ran to stations. Deck gunners loaded belts. Above them, a wall of Hellcats fanned out across the sky like blue phantoms. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was about to begin. At 20,000 feet, Vraciu sighted the first formation of dive bombers. They were still climbing, oblivious. He rolled, inverted, dropped his nose, and dove the Hellcat, howling through the thin air. His guns opened up. 6 streams of tracer fire lanced into the sky, ripping through the Japanese formation. One bomber erupted in flame, then another, and another. Within 30 seconds, 4 aircraft spiraled into the sea. The radio came alive with shouts, "Splash 2, Splash 5. They're dropping out like flies." Down below, radar screens lit up with chaos. The Japanese strike formations disintegrated under the first American volleys. Most of their pilots were barely trained boys rushed from flight schools after only a few hours in the cockpit. Their tactics, once precise, had crumbled under desperation. "Keep them off the fleet," barked Commander David McCampbell. "Don't let a single one through." Far below, the USS Hornet's crew watched through binoculars as dozens of burning planes fell from the sky. The ocean erupted in geysers of flame and debris. Within minutes, the horizon looked like a graveyard of smoke columns. In the sky, Vraciu spotted another group, Jill torpedo bombers skimming low over the waves. He nosed over again, diving to attack. "Bingo fuel," his wingman warned. "Then make it count!" Vraciu snapped. He lined up his sights, pressed the trigger. The first torpedo plane exploded. He shifted aim, fired again. The second burst into a ball of orange fire. A third tried to bank away, but the Hellcat's guns shredded its tail. 3 kills in 20 seconds. Vraciu's ammo counter hit 0. He banked hard, smoke trailing from his guns, and watched as his wingman finished the rest. 9 confirmed kills in one sortie, a record that would echo through naval aviation for decades. By noon, the airwaves were filled with static and victory. "Task Force 58, this is Cap Command. Enemy raid annihilated. Estimated 300 enemy aircraft destroyed. Repeat, 300 enemy aircraft destroyed in one day." On the Japanese carrier, Shokaku smoke poured from the flight deck. Pilots who made it back landed on ships already burning. Others ditched in the sea engines, seized fuel gone. Rear Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's mobile fleet, stared at the reports in disbelief. Every message carried the same tone: few survivors. Heavy losses. He slammed his fist on the chart table. They can't all be gone. Launch the second wave. But the truth was undeniable. Japan's once invincible air arm had been shattered. The Empire had sent its best and found only death waiting in the clouds. As dusk fell over the Philippine Sea, the last of the Hellcats landed back on their carrier's wings, folding engines, cooling in the twilight. Deck crews counted bullet holes, patched fuel lines, and tallied ammunition. One pilot joked, "We ran out of targets before we ran out of daylight." Below-deck radio operators sent a coded message to Admiral Chester Nimitz aboard USS Enterprise. Air superiority established. Enemy air groups destroyed. Request permission to pursue at dawn. Permission came swiftly. And as the Pacific night swallowed the fleet, the men of Task Force 58 knew tomorrow they would finish what the Hellcats had begun. They had turned the tide of the Pacific, and somewhere across the dark sea, the Emperor's last hope was burning out. June 20th, 1944. The morning of June 20th, 1944, dawned quiet. Too quiet. Across the wide expanse of the Philippine Sea, the surface shimmered like polished steel. There were no black columns of smoke, no distant engine whines, just the soft hum of wind over the decks of the American carriers. But everyone aboard Task Force 58 knew that silence in war was never peace. It was the inhale before the strike. On the USS Enterprise, Commander David McCampbell, the calm and deliberate air group leader, sipped bitter coffee from a tin mug as his Hellcat crews prepped for launch. His logbook lay open beside him, a single line from yesterday's entry underlined in pencil. Enemy losses catastrophic. But they will come again. The previous day had been chaos, hundreds of Japanese planes shredded by the Hellcats' 50 caliber Fury. But intelligence now reported something worse. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carriers were still at large, retreating west, but not destroyed. Their air wings were gone, but their decks, those floating airfields, still threatened the Allied advance. The order from Admiral Raymond Spruance was clear: find them, destroy them, end it. McCampbell stood, zipped up his flight jacket, and headed for the flight deck. A line of F-6F Hellcats, TBF Avengers, and SB-2C Helldivers stretched into the sunrise, a column of vengeance poised to strike across the horizon. At 0800 hours, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, gave the order. His voice was steady, but his words carried history. Launch all aircraft. Full strike. Target Japanese fleet 275 miles west. No carrier commander had ever launched a full strike this far from base. It was a one-way mission, unless the fleet could find the enemy, and fast. Pilots whispered it to each other before takeoff: fly west. Kill the enemy. Pray you find the ships before dark. The decks thundered with life. Propellers blurred. Engines screamed. From 11 carriers, nearly 240 aircraft clawed into the sky. Hellcats for escort, Avengers for torpedo runs, Helldivers for the fatal dive. Among them was Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, once again his plane patched from the previous day's battle, but ready for more. He glanced down as the carrier shrank beneath him, replaced by endless blue. "Let's find those bastards," he muttered. At 15,000 feet, the air formation stretched for miles, silver arrows glinting in the sun. Below, the Pacific rolled endlessly, hypnotic and vast. Somewhere out there, over the curve of the earth, was the Japanese mobile fleet, bloodied but not broken. Hours passed. Fuel gauges dipped lower. Then, just before 1600 hours, the call came through the radio like electricity. Enemy sighted 2 carriers bearing 270, distance 20 miles. It was Lieutenant R.H. Harmer leading a scouting flight. The strike group turned instantly. From the cockpit, Vraciu could see faint black smudges on the horizon ships. Big ones. Target confirmed. McCampbell's voice came through the radio. "This is it, boys. Give them hell." The Hellcats dove first, clearing the skies of the last few enemy fighters. They were A6 M50s, worn slow and flown by half-trained cadets. It was no longer a contest. It was execution. Within minutes, the sky above the Japanese fleet was chaos. Tracer rounds stitched through clouds. Helldivers peeled off their bomb bays, yawning open. Avengers followed low torpedoes shimmering under their wings. From the Japanese carrier, Hio flak guns opened up, bursting black puffs into the sky. Gunners shouted, "Incoming." Pilots scrambled to take off, but the deck was already burning. The first 1,000-pound bomb hit dead center. It tore through the flight deck, detonating beneath the hangar bay. Flames leapt skyward as parked aircraft ignited one by one, a chain of explosions racing down the length of the ship. A second bomb struck near the bridge, direct hit. Within minutes, Hio was listing hard to port its crew, diving overboard into the burning sea. Vratsu banked left, diving on a destroyer escorting the carrier. He opened fire, his tracers walking across the deck until a gun mount exploded. Below, torpedoes from Avengers sliced into the hulls of Japanese cruisers, their wakes bright against the darkening water. The entire Japanese task group, Ozawa's proud fleet, was being torn apart one ship at a time. In the middle of the inferno, Rear Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, Zuikaku Jaw, clenched the radio, hissing with reports of disaster. Hio lost. Taiho exploded, Shokaku burning uncontrollably. He turned to his chief of staff. "They've taken the air, and now the sea." By dusk, the attack was over. As the last Hellcats turned east toward the setting sun, the ocean behind them burned orange, 3 carriers sinking, 2 cruisers crippled, dozens of aircraft falling like meteors into the sea. It was the death of Japan's carrier force, the end of an empire's reach. Yet for the men flying home, victory carried its own danger. The horizon was fading, and the fleet was still hundreds of miles away. "Bingo fuel," McCampbell warned. "We'll never make it back before dark." "Sir," a pilot radioed, voice tight with fear, "we won't even find the fleet. The sun's gone." But then, from the black horizon ahead, came a sight none of them would forget. At 2200 hours, Admiral Mitcher gave an unprecedented order. "Turn on the lights." Instantly, the night ocean lit up with hundreds of pinpoints, deck lights, search beams, signal lamps, the American carriers revealing themselves to guide their men home. It broke every rule of naval warfare, risking submarine attack, but it saved hundreds of lives. From miles away, pilots saw it, a galaxy of light on the dark Pacific welcoming them back. Vratsu's fuel gauge was empty when he saw the lights of the Lexington faint but steady. He glided in silently, engines sputtering, wheels kissing the deck, just as the last glow of dusk disappeared. Behind him, another pilot landed on fumes. Another ditched nearby rescue boats racing into the water. By midnight, nearly every plane was accounted for. The final tally came hours later. Japanese losses: 3 carriers, 2 oilers, 430 aircraft destroyed. American losses: craft, most to fuel, not enemy fire. The ratio spoke for itself. One of the greatest air victories in history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was complete. The Japanese Navy would never recover. Admiral Mitcher, exhausted but calm, wrote a single line in his report. Before turning in, "The enemy air arm is finished. From now on, we own the Pacific sky." June 21st, 1944. Morning came quietly. The skies that had burned with fire the day before were now empty, washed clean by salt air and sunlight. For the men aboard Task Force 58, the silence felt unreal, like waking after a storm that had almost erased the sound of the world. The sea was calm. The decks were littered with bullet casings, spent cartridges, and fragments of burned paint. A few scorched Hellcats sat near the edge of the flight deck, their wings-folded engines still ticking from the previous night's heat. Sailors moved carefully among them, checking gun mounts and fuel tanks, their faces streaked with oil and exhaustion. Lieutenant Alex Vratsu sat on an ammo crate near the bow helmet, off hair matted with sweat. His flight log was open on his knee. 9 kills in one day, a number that should have made him a legend. But he wasn't smiling. "Hey," Ace called Ensign Parker. "You realize you got more kills yesterday than some squadrons did all month." Vratsu didn't look up. He simply said, "They were boys, Parker." Some of them barely had the paint dry on their planes. He paused, then added quietly, "War's not supposed to feel this one-sided." Parker hesitated, unsure how to respond. Then the PA system crackled to life. "All hands, this is the captain. The enemy carrier force has been destroyed. Prepare to refuel and rearm. Orders from Admiral Spruance continue west." Vratiu closed his logbook and stood. The war wasn't done yet. Below deck, the intelligence room was alive with chatter. Radio operators translated intercepted Japanese signals. Losses catastrophic. Request replacement pilots. Carrier divisions unable to launch. Fuel exhausted. The Japanese Navy, once the most feared in the Pacific, had lost its eyes. No aircraft meant no reconnaissance. Commander David McCampbell leaned over the shoulder of a young analyst. "Do we have the final count?" The analyst nodded. "Between the Lexington Enterprise, Yorktown, and Essex groups, 373 confirmed aerial kills, sir." McCampbell exhaled. "That's not an air battle," he said. "That's a massacre." He turned to the others in the room. "Gentlemen, we've just destroyed their air force in a single day. But don't make the mistake of thinking they're finished." Hundreds of miles away, aboard the Japanese flagship Zuikaku, the deck still reeked of burned oil. Crewmen scrubbed blood and soot from the planks. Rear Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood over the plotting table, staring at the last surviving map of his carrier group. Only 3 ships remained operational. His chief of staff spoke softly. "Sir, we have pilots requesting to be reassigned to kamikaze duty." Ozawa didn't respond. He simply kept his gaze fixed on the chart. "Tell them," he said finally, "they will have their chance soon enough." Back in the American fleet, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the flag bridge of the USS Indianapolis. Behind him, his chief of staff reported, "Sir, we've confirmed destruction of the enemy's main air arm. No organized counterattack expected." Spruance didn't move. "They threw everything they had at us. Carriers' air wings fuel the last of their trained pilots." He lowered the binoculars, and it wasn't enough, not even close. He turned to his staff. "Send this to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl. The enemy's naval air power has ceased to exist as an organized force." Spruance stared west toward the dark outline of the Marianas. He knew what came next: the invasion of Saipan, the push to Guam, and then Japan. That evening, the ready room aboard the Lexington was packed. Pilots, mechanics, and gunners sat shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Commander McCampbell stood at the front. "Gentlemen, yesterday we did what no other air group in history has done. We met the full strength of an enemy fleet, and we erased it. I know what some of you are thinking. You saw them burn. You saw them fall. But remember this: every man in those planes believed he was fighting for his home. Don't let arrogance blind you. Because the next time we go up, it might not be easy. It might not even be fair. But it will still be war." He paused. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow we go again." Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the scent of the sea. Vratiu stopped at the railing and looked out at the horizon, a horizon that now belonged to the United States Navy. The stars reflected off the water like shattered glass. In that reflection, he saw what victory looked like: bright, distant, and built on sacrifice. For Japan, the realization was dawning too. Their empire had reached its high water mark. From here on, it would only recede. But for the pilots of the Hellcats, the war wasn't over. It was just flying toward its darkest chapter. June 22, 1944. The morning mist rolled across the vast deck of the USS Lexington, curling around the wings of silent Hellcats like ghostly shrouds. The roar of engines was gone, replaced by the low hum of generators and the rhythmic creak of the ship as it cut through calm seas. For the first time in days, no alarms blared. No pilots sprinted to cockpits. The sky, that eternal arena of life and death, was empty. Lieutenant Alex Vratiu leaned against the flight deck railing, a mug of black coffee in his hand. The Pacific stretched to infinity before him, silver and blue, broken only by the faint outline of smoke on the far horizon. the smoldering remnants of Japan's once proud carrier fleet. He glanced down at the flight deck where mechanics worked in silence. Some polished the burn marks off Hellcat fuselages. Others stacked spent ammunition belts into neat rows. Every action carried a ritual precision, as if trying to restore order after chaos. "Hard to believe it's over," said a voice behind him. It was Commander David McCampbell, still in his flight jacket, clipboard tucked under his arm. "For now," Vrachu replied. "But we both know they'll make us prove it again." McCampbell gave a small nod, his gaze lost in the horizon. "Maybe," he said. "But yesterday proved something bigger. We didn't just win a fight, we ended an era." The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm, the weapon that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, was gone. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had done more than destroy planes. It had erased Japan's ability to train replacements. Their veteran pilots were dead. Their aircraft production was crippled. Their carriers were now little more than floating targets. Below decks, the intelligence section was buzzing with new intercepts. Radio operators transcribed faint, desperate signals from command. "Air strength lost. Cannot coordinate. Carrier divisions ineffective. Request reinforcements from homeland." Reinforcements that would never come. Commander James Doolittle traced his finger along the island chain. "Gentlemen, we've just torn a hole straight through their shield. Saipan, Tinian, Guam all exposed. Once we take them, our bombers can reach Tokyo itself. Sir, that means—" Yes. The war just entered its final act. Across the Pacific in Tokyo, the mood was far darker. In the basement of Naval HQ, officers huddled around a decoded message from Ozawa. "Mobile fleet combat ineffective. Air arm annihilated. Request permission to withdraw remaining vessels to home waters." Captain Takashi Fuchida, once leader of the Pearl Harbor raid, read the message twice. "They did in one day what took us 3 years to build." The room was silent, except for distant air raid sirens, American bombers already approaching the home islands. For the first time, Japan's high command understood that the tide had turned not just militarily, but industrially. The U.S. could replace planes pilots and ships faster than Japan could even build fuel drums. Back aboard the Lexington, the pilots gathered for debrief. McCampbell drew tactical arcs on the board. Coordination, that's what made it possible. They came at us in waves, but every wave was blind. We saw them first every time. "Sir, will they try again? They'll have to. But next time it'll be survival." That night the sea was calm again. A low moon turned the Pacific silver. Vrachu cleaned the soot from his Hellcat's guns. Nearby sailors talked about home baseball and the girls they'd left behind, but one topic kept returning: what came next. They knew Saipan would fall soon. After that, Tinian. Then Tokyo would be in reach. The war had changed. From now on, Japan would not just lose battles, it would lose its skies, its cities, and finally, its will to fight. As the ship rolled gently under a sky full of stars, the ocean whispered how vast and fragile the world really was. Vratsiu leaned back, thinking of the Japanese pilots he'd downed, men who had flown into death knowing the odds. He wondered what it meant to win a war that could no longer be fought evenly. Below, the engines rumbled. Above, the flag snapped in the wind. The Pacific was theirs, now bought with courage, precision, and steel. But victory always carried an echo. That echo, faint but growing, was the sound of the next battle calling. June 23, 1944, the next day began not with the roar of engines, but with the hum of logistics. Rows of aircraft sat lined along the decks of the carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Lexington, their wings folded neatly like resting birds. Deck crews swarmed over them, checking hydraulics, changing oil, rearming guns, and replacing torn fuselage panels. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the reason the Americans had won. Behind every kill, every sortie, every mission was a machine of war that ran with the precision of an assembly line, because in many ways it was. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Kincaid barked orders across the deck as cranes swung bombs into racks and sailors rolled barrels of avgas. "Keep the ordnance dry," he shouted. I don't want another spark near that hose. Hellcat pilots walked among the crews, watching as the same hands that had fueled their victories prepared them for another flight. It was a dance of coordination, the silent ballet of American industrial power stretching from Detroit to a ship thousands of miles from home. Below decks, Ensign Robert Geller tapped out a coded message to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Enemy air power in Central Pacific effectively neutralized. All remaining fleet units withdrawing westward. Request confirmation of Operation Forager continuation. Nimitz's reply came hours later, crisp and confident. Proceed. Capture Marianas. Establish B-29 airfields. Begin the road to Tokyo. Those 12 words carried the weight of an empire's fall. In a crowded hangar bay, pilots lounged on folding chairs, helmets beside them, the smell of oil and sweat thick in the air. A projector flickered gun camera film from the previous day's battle. Tracer lines streaked across the sky wings, snapping smoke trails spinning. Every few seconds, someone murmured a name. That's Reggie's kill. That's mine right before I ran out of ammo. Commander David McCampbell stepped beside the screen. We call it victory, he said quietly, but every blip falling, there was a man. Each believed he was doing the right thing for his country. Silence filled the room, not gloating, but gravity. Dominance in the sky came at a cost measured not just in lives lost, but in what victory did to those who achieved it. Half a world away, the Japanese High Command held its own meeting beneath Tokyo. Maps of the Pacific spread across a table lit by a single bulb. Exhausted officers read Admiral Ozawa's final report. Losses catastrophic. Mobile fleet ceased to function. Enemy air superiority absolute. Toyota closed his eyes and said, "Not yet, tell the Emperor. Sir, what remains courage? Nothing else." His words hung like ashes in the stale air. Back in the Pacific, the men of Task Force 58 ate in silence, powdered eggs, canned peaches, and black coffee. Vrachu sat with crew chief Pete Reynolds, who had spent 2 days repairing bullet holes in Hellcat wings. You ever think about how fast it all happened? Yeah. 1 minute we're outnumbered. The next, there's no one left to fight. Guess that's what happens when Detroit builds your planes and Chicago builds your bullets. They both chuckled. The truth hit hard. The Pacific War wasn't just courage, it was production. America's factories could replace what Japan couldn't. By mid-afternoon, the fleet turned north toward the Marianas. From the bridge, Admiral Mitcher watched smoke still rising where carriers had burned. Sir, will we see more enemy planes? No. The sky belongs to us now, Mitcher said. Then softly, let's make sure we keep it. That night, under a deep Pacific sky, the task force sailed on a constellation of light and steel, moving west into history. The pilots watched the stars, unaware their victory would soon lead to the war's terrible conclusion. For now, they only knew this: the air war over the Pacific had changed forever. The Hellcat, once mocked as clumsy, had become the symbol of unstoppable force. June 24, 1944. The Philippine Sea stretched out in every direction, vast and quiet, its rolling swells hiding the wreckage of an empire. Beneath those calm waves lay hundreds of aircraft, the shattered remnants of Japan's naval air arm. To the men of Task Force 58, the battle was over. To the Japanese, it was the day their sky had died. On the deck of the USS Yorktown, sailors leaned against railings, staring into the endless horizon. The sun was low, burning gold against the water, and for the first time in 3 years, the Pacific didn't feel like enemy territory. The radios were quiet, except for the occasional transmission from Fleet Command, weather reports, refueling orders, messages to submarines. There were few survivors. Here and there, a life raft bobbed in the distance, drifting in silence. The seabirds circled, curious. A destroyer would approach, lower a boat, and pluck up what remained of Japanese airmen. For the Americans, rescue meant duty. For the Japanese, it meant the shame of survival. Below deck in the Lexington's wardroom, Admiral Mark Mitcher sat at a long table surrounded by his staff. The light was dim, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Maps and casualty reports covered every inch of the table. He rubbed his temples. Gentlemen, the Marianas are secure. Our losses are minimal. We've done what we came here to do. A young officer replied, Sir, the Japanese carriers have retreated west. Intercepts indicate they're regrouping near Okinawa. Mitcher shook his head. Regrouping, no. They're retreating to die slower. They won't recover from this. His intelligence chief looked up. And yet, sir, they'll keep fighting. Mitcher smiled faintly. Of course they will. They don't know how to stop. That's why we have to make sure we never let them stand again. Across the Pacific in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito sat in silence as his aides delivered the news. It came not as one announcement, but as a cascade. Hiyo sunk. Taiho exploded. Shokaku lost contact. Over 400 aircraft destroyed. The emperor listened without expression, then said, So the air has left the sea. Admiral Toyota bowed. Your Majesty, we will rebuild. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Factories were bombed. Fuel was scarce. Aluminum was gone. The surviving pilots were barely teenagers. Japan could not rebuild. The empire's sun had reached its zenith, and now it was falling. On the Enterprise, Hellcat pilots gathered around a radio, listening to a Tokyo broadcast intercepted earlier. Our fleet has engaged the enemy east of the Marianas. The struggle was fierce, the outcome uncertain. But our pilots fought with honor and devotion to the Emperor. Lieutenant Vraciu switched it off. Uncertain, he muttered. That's one way to say obliterated. Ensign Parker leaned back. You think they'll ever admit they lost? Vraciu shook his head. They don't need to say it. The ocean's saying it for them. There was a silence. You ever wonder if they're sitting in some ready room like this, asking the same thing about us? Vraciu looked at him, then nodded. Yeah, I do. Far below deck in the engine rooms, turbines whirred men in sweat-stained coveralls keeping the ships alive. For every pilot whose name would make the papers, hundreds would remain invisible, the ones who fueled victory from the shadows. Orders kept coming. New missions, new targets. The path to Tokyo was long islands to be taken one by one. That night on the Yorktown's deck, sailors sat under the stars, passing around a battered harmonica. Someone played a soft tune carrying faintly across the sea over the graves of the men they'd fought. Vraciu listened by his plane. He wasn't thinking of kills or glory, but of the faces he'd seen through his gun sights. War had made him a hero. But in moments like this, he wondered what it had taken in return. The stars above shimmered like bullet holes in the night sky. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan's surviving admirals stared into the same darkness, realizing their empire was crumbling, piece by piece beneath the weight of its own silence. June 25, 1944, the sun rose red over the Pacific, a heavy bruised red that bled across the sea like memory. The horizon was empty again. No contrails, no silhouettes, no wings. Only silence and the soft hiss of salt wind against steel. For the pilots of Task Force 58, it was an eerie calm, the kind that makes even victors uneasy. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu stood on the deck of the USS Lexington, squinting east. The light caught the faint shimmer of oil slicks on the surface, long dark ribbons stretching for miles. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like aftermath. Morning looks clean, said Ensign Parker, stepping up beside him. Yeah, Vraciu muttered, too clean. You ever think about where they all went down, thousands of them gone in minutes? They're still down there, Vraciu said quietly. The ocean doesn't forget. Behind them, the loudspeakers crackled. Attention all hands. Admiral Spruance's orders confirmed. Task Force 58 to proceed west toward the Marianas for continued support of Operation Forager. The voice was calm, but everyone knew what it meant, no rest. The war was still rolling forward. In the Lexington's ready room, the pilots gathered again for briefing. Commander McCampbell stood at the front. The Japanese fleet has ceased to function, but our ground troops still need air support. We'll be flying cover for the landings on Saipan and Tinian. Expect light resistance. A young pilot asked, Sir, are we sure they have anything left to fly? McCampbell smiled faintly. Maybe a few planes. Maybe a few men crazy enough to try. He added, "Don't get comfortable. The moment we underestimate them, they'll remind us what desperation looks like." Across the Pacific, in the crippled carrier Zuikaku, Rear Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge. His uniform was stained with salt and smoke. His face looked older than his years. A junior officer asked, "Admiral, the Americans are moving west. Should we engage again?" Ozawa turned slowly. "Engage with what we have 9 operational aircraft. We are a fleet without wings." The officer hesitated. Then, "What are your orders? Sail home," Ozawa said. "The war has left us behind." Meanwhile in Washington, headlines blared, U.S. Navy destroys Japanese air arm Marianas secured. In factories across America, workers paused to read, then went back to work. The war machine never stopped. That afternoon, Vratu and Parker sat on the edge of the flight deck, legs dangling over the sea. Parker pulled a small photo from his jacket, a woman smiling in front of a clapboard house. "She sent this before we shipped out," he said. "Your wife, yeah. She said she'd wait." There was a pause. "You think we'll ever really go home?" "We'll go home," Vratu said, "but we'll never leave this behind." In the afternoon light, the fleet passed over the graves of its enemies, silent, eternal. From the bridge, Admiral Mitcher watched the horizon. "History will call this victory." His officer nodded. Mitcher said softly, "For every plane we shot down, a man fell from the sky. Don't forget that." That night, as darkness swallowed the Pacific, the fleet's running lights flickered on. The sea was calm. The wind was low. And in the stillness, a truth settled over the men aboard Task Force 58. They had conquered the air, but not their own thoughts. Victory had come, but it carried the sound of silence, the kind that follows when there's no one left to fight. June 26, 1944, dawn crept over the Pacific like a bruise healing into gold. The warships of Task Force 58 glided westward through calm seas, their wakes trailing long white scars across the water. The smell of salt and diesel hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of burnt oil, a ghostly reminder of what they'd left behind. On the USS Enterprise, the ship's loudspeakers cracked to life. "Reveille, reveille, all hands heave out and trice up. Breakfast for flight crews at 0600. Launch operations at 0700. Weather favorable." It was the voice of routine, but beneath it, everyone felt the weight of what had happened. In just 48 hours, the Hellcats had done the impossible, crushed Japan's naval air arm so completely that the enemy could no longer challenge them. But now the aftermath lingered like the smoke from a firestorm. Lieutenant Alex Vratu was among the first on deck. He walked slowly past rows of planes, their metal skins gleaming orange in the morning light. Mechanics worked silently, tightening bolts, checking ammo belts, wiping down canopies. There was no chatter, only the rhythmic clang of tools and the far-off thump of the ocean. He stopped at his Hellcat, the name Angel's Fury stenciled beneath the cockpit. The nose still bore streaks of soot from the last mission. Vratu reached out, running his hand along the fuselage. "This bird took me through hell and back," he murmured. His crew chief, Pete Reynolds, handed him a clipboard. "Signed her out for another sortie, Lieutenant. Orders are coming down from Mitcher Recon over the Marianas." Vratu glanced up. "We're not done, are we?" Reynolds smiled faintly. "Doesn't look like the war got that memo." By 0700, the carrier's decks were alive again. Engines roared, propellers blurred. The smell of aviation gas filled the air, and the sound of the launch catapults thundered like cannon fire. Hellcats lifted off, one after another, their wings catching the morning light before vanishing into the haze. From the bridge, Admiral Mark Mitcher watched the launches through binoculars. Beside him stood Admiral Raymond Spruance. "Do you think they'll come back?" Ray Mitcher asked. Spruance's eyes didn't leave the horizon. "No, not in force. They've spent what they had." He paused, then added, "But desperation breeds strange things. Cornered nations do not die quietly." Mitcher nodded. "Then we'll be ready when the noise returns." Hundreds of miles away on the island of Saipan, the noise never stopped. U.S. Marines clawed their way inland, fighting through hills and sugarcane fields under relentless heat. The Japanese defenders, cut off from air support, low on ammunition, fought with a ferocity that defied logic. When the fleet's Hellcats arrived overhead, the Marines looked up and cheered. For the first time, American pilots ruled the Pacific sky completely. They strafed strongpoints, bombed artillery positions, and guided naval gunfire with impunity. To the Marines below, those silver-winged shadows meant life. To the Japanese soldiers, they meant inevitability. Over the radio, Blue 2, this is Ground Fox. I got enemy armor moving down the ravine grid 756. You see it? The pilot replied, calm and clipped affirmative. Ground Fox. I see them. Watch the tree line. Seconds later, the sky screamed. 6 Hellcats dropped in low, their guns tearing through the foliage. The jungle erupted in fire. The Marines cheered again, but awe mixed with a flicker of fear at the sheer power unleashed. In Tokyo, Admiral Toyota sat in his office, a cold cup of tea beside him. His staff shuffled nervously as he reviewed a report from the front. Losses total. No organized air defense remains in the Marianas. He set the paper down and stared through the window at the city skyline. High above, American reconnaissance planes droned beyond reach. He turned to his aide and said quietly, "They will come soon, not as fighters, but as fire." Back on the Enterprise, McCampbell stood in the radar room watching green sweeps turn slowly across the circular screen. He tapped a pencil. "No enemy signals, none, sir." The operator replied, "It's just us out there." Just us, McCampbell repeated, not pride but realization. There was no longer a war in the air, only dominance. That night, the fleet anchored off Saipan. The stars were out again, bright, infinite, cruel. From the beach, the glow of burning villages flickered like dying lanterns. Vratziu sat on the wing of his Hellcat, looking toward the island, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. Parker joined him, handing over a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. "You think this is what victory's supposed to feel like?" Vratziu didn't answer at first. Then he said quietly, "It's supposed to feel better." They sat in silence as the sea rocked gently beneath them. And somewhere across the Pacific, Japan's warlords plotted their final gamble. A strategy of death built on the only resource they had left: human lives. July 1st, 1944. The war had entered a new phase, quieter but darker. The sky over the Pacific no longer belonged to 2 armies locked in combat. It belonged to one. And the empire that had once ruled it from the rising sun now searched its own ruins for the will to keep fighting. In a half-bombed hangar outside Kure, Japanese engineers worked by candlelight, surrounded by twisted metal and ash. Lieutenant Noboru Aida watched his crew try to salvage a half-destroyed Zero fighter. Its wings warped, its engine borrowed from another wreck. One mechanic muttered, "We can't build enough, not even to defend the homeland." Ida stared at a poster, a smiling pilot, under the words, "For the Emperor, fight on." If Japan could not match America's machines, it would turn to something else: fanaticism. The first whispers of the special attack units had already begun. Far across that same ocean, the decks of Task Force 58 thrummed again with motion. Hellcats roared to life, but now the missions were methodical destruction, not dogfights. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had ended the air war, Vratziu thought. Now what's left is extermination. Mission parameters, he asked through his headset. "Sweep the Bonin Islands. Destroy all transports. No air opposition expected." He repeated flatly, "No opposition expected." Hours later, over turquoise waters, black silhouettes crawled below 4 ships, slow and doomed. He pressed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber guns roared. Tracers tore the decks apart. No return fire came. Just smoke. Just silence. "It's like killing ghosts," he muttered. Back on Lexington, the crew cheered faintly. 4 ships destroyed. "Good work," Reynolds said. Vratziu wiped sweat from his brow. "Good work," he echoed. "There's no one left to fight back." Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Admiral Toyota faced his surviving staff. "Our carriers cannot launch. Our pilots are dead. Our fuel is gone." He whispered, "Then we must turn our deaths into weapons." It was here in the ashes of the Philippine Sea that the kamikaze was born. Back on the Enterprise, Commander McCampbell wrote, "The men are restless. The victory feels hollow. We have won the air. Now we must fight the sea, the land, and the spirit of a nation that will not surrender." He closed his book and looked toward Japan, still distant, but inevitable. That night on the deck of the Lexington, the air was heavy and quiet. Vratiu sat beside his plane, tracing patched bullet holes. "It's over for them," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew the war wasn't finished. It was only changing shape. July 3, 1944, the Pacific had grown deceptively peaceful. Sunlight scattered off the waves like shards of glass. The fleet of Task Force 58 cruised westward, beneath a sky so clear it almost made men forget. The decks were busy again, planes taxiing, fuel lines running, but the rhythm had changed. Lieutenant Alex Vratiu walked the deck in silence. He stopped beside his Hellcat Angel's Fury and stared at the red rising suns painted below the cockpit. 9, actually, his crew chief said. "You got your 9th in the Turkey Shoot. I'll paint it on later." Below deck, Commander David McCampbell and Admiral Mark Mitcher reviewed reconnaissance photos. Rows of destroyed Japanese aircraft lay in ruins. McCampbell tapped one of the photos. "We've erased their wings, sir." Mitcher sighed. "They'll recover in spirit. That's the part we can't bomb." Thousands of miles away in Honolulu, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the report. "Japan's Air Force isn't just defeated," he said. "It's extinct." Back aboard the Lexington, Vratiu stood at sunset. The color of burning oil, he thought. "We're fighting ghosts now." That night, the officers' mess was silent. Spruance finally said, what's left for them, the sea mines, the kamikaze, the fanatics. In Tokyo, Vice Admiral Onishi spoke for the first time. "If we cannot return, we must not return. The pilot himself will be the bomb." And in that moment, the kamikaze was born. Back in the Pacific, Vratiu sat beside his plane. He wrote, "The sky is ours now, but the cost keeps climbing." Tomorrow they would fly again. Not because enemies remained, but because war never knew how to stop. July 10, 1944, the heat was suffocating. Even before sunrise, the decks of the USS Lexington shimmered with trapped warmth. The smell of oil, sea salt, and gunmetal clung to everything, the taste of war that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Below decks, men slept in hammocks slung shoulder to shoulder, their dreams punctuated by the rhythmic thrum of engines. Above in the flight-ready room, the pilots of VF-16 Fighting Aces gathered in near silence. A chalkboard on the wall read, "Mission 121 Recon and Strike Formosa, Luzon Shipping." Lieutenant Alex Vratiu stared at it for a long time, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Next to him, Ensign Parker fidgeted with his gloves. "You ever think this'll end?" Alex Vratiu gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, just not for us." The briefing officer's voice cut through the hum of the ventilation fans. "Intel confirms limited air resistance. You'll be flying at Angels 15. Stay tight on comms. Return by 14:30. The pilots stood. Helmets clicked. Gloves tightened. Faces hardened. It was the same ritual they'd performed 100 times, but each time a little more of their humanity seemed to drain away. At 0700, the first flight launched. Engines roared to life, propellers slicing the air like thunder. The deck officers waved signal paddles, directing the takeoffs in perfect rhythm. One by one, the Hellcats leapt into the sky, climbing toward the sunrise blue silhouettes against a bleeding orange horizon. As Vratiu's plane reached altitude, his headset crackled to life. "Blue Leader, this is Tower. Godspeed, boys." He keyed the mic. "Roger, Tower. Keep the coffee hot." The formation banked east, the ocean below, stretching out in endless ripples of light. An hour later, they spotted their target, a Japanese supply convoy, small, maybe 6 ships running south at full speed. Vratiu narrowed his eyes. No escorts. No cap. Easy pickings. He leveled out, giving hand signals. 2 flights. Line abreast. Attack from 20 degrees port. Fire in pairs. He pushed the throttle forward. The Hellcat's nose dipped, the world tilting, as the ocean rushed up to meet him. The first ship, a coastal freighter, filled his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger. .650 caliber Browning spat fire tracers walking across the deck and into the bridge. Flames erupted instantly. Behind him, Parker whooped over the radio. Direct hit. That's a cooker, Alex, stay focused. Sweep the rest. Make it count. They made it count. In under 4 minutes, 3 ships were burning, 2 were listing, and 1 had vanished entirely beneath the waves. But something about the ease of it unsettled them. There were no returning shots. No planes. No resistance. It was like bombing graveyards. By the time they returned to the fleet, the sun was high. Vrasiu taxied his Hellcat to a stop, shut off the engine, and sat in silence for a long time before climbing down. The deck crew clapped him on the back. Hell of a strike, Lieutenant. They didn't know what hit him. He nodded but didn't smile. Commander McCampbell met him near the ready room. You did good work out there, he said. Vrasiu looked up at him, eyes distant. Sir, it's starting to feel like we're fighting shadows. The sky's empty. The sea's empty. We're killing what's already dead. McCampbell's jaw tightened. Maybe, but we finish what we start. He turned away before Vrasiu could answer. That evening, the crew gathered on deck to watch the sunset. Someone had set up a phonograph, and an old record played Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. Men laughed, traded jokes, smoked, and for a fleeting moment it almost felt like peace. Then the loudspeaker crackled. Attention all hands. Report from the Marianas Saipan secured. Guam engagement ongoing. Heavy casualties reported. The laughter died instantly. Vrasiu stared toward the western horizon, toward Guam, and whispered, They're dying for every foot of land we take. U.S. Marines described them as coming out of the ground, silent until they struck. The air support was constant, Hellcats strafing day and night, but still the enemy came. In one dispatch, a Marine radio operator wrote, They're not human anymore. They crawl through mud, blood, and fire, and they keep coming. God help us when we reach Japan. It meant the homeland was within range of American B-29 bombers. One officer slammed his fist on the table. This is the turning point, he shouted. We must strike back before they reach the home islands. Admiral Toyota said nothing. He simply stared at the map. He could see it clearly, the encroaching ring of blue, the tightening noose. For the first time, he whispered aloud the words no one dared speak, we have already lost. The stars burned above him, cold, distant, indifferent. The sea was still a mirror for the heavens. He thought of the enemy pilots he'd never met. He thought of the sky now silent and clean. And he thought of what would come next, the invasion of islands, the firebombing of cities, the death of civilians. He lit a cigarette, exhaled, and said softly, We took their sky. Now we'll take their world. The ember glowed briefly, then went dark. July 20th, 1944. The smoke had long since faded from the Philippine Sea, but its shape remained carved into strategy rooms and flight logs, into the faces of men who had lived through it. For Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, the kill markings on Angel's Fury were no longer just tally marks. They were a ledger of consequence. Each red rising sun painted beneath his cockpit was a human life and a turning point in a war being waged on the scale of nations. On the bridge of the USS Enterprise, Admiral Mark Mitcher sat with his staff and stared not at immediate targets, but at the map back home, at lines on which B-29 routes would soon be drawn. The Marianas were secure. Saipan and Tinian would host the bombers that could reach Tokyo. The carriers had won the sea for the Allies. The carriers and the new strategic bombers together now owned the theater. Admiral, his operations officer said softly, our fighters have proven the F-6F's superiority in sustained combat. The R-2800 gave us power. The airframe and armor gave us survival. The twin 50 Brownings gave us teeth. The IJN cannot replace trained pilots at the rate we can replace aircraft. Mitcher nodded. He understood the arithmetic of industrial war better than most. The ratio of replacement matters more than the ratio of winners on a single day. Yesterday's victory is compounded by our factory's ability to keep going. On July 12th, in the chambers of the Naval General Staff, Admiral Toyota and his chiefs traced the last routes of logistics. They counted aluminum fuel-trained pilots, dwindling resources that would turn brave plans into desperate improvisations. The phrase whispered among them was the same irreversible attrition. Every carrier lost every veteran shot down on June 19th to 20, cut the lifeline for future operations. Rear Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, when he finally reported to the Emperor's advisors, used a single word that carried the weight of an empire's confession: broken. The air arm that had once ruled the Pacific was not merely diminished, it could no longer create the conditions for decisive action. What remained would not be an air force, but a stream of replacements. Quickly trained pilots rushed aircraft tactics that relied on faith more than skill. In that vacuum, darker ideas took root. If planes and carriers could no longer guarantee victory, then lives could be applied as weapons in place of wings. Commanders like Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi would formalize the practice of special attack units, kamikaze, a doctrine born of attrition and desperation, a moral and tactical response to a loss of industrial parity. Back on the deck of Lexington, McCampbell reviewed gun camera reels with a quiet intensity. The footage was clinical flashes of canopies, the fracture of a fuselage, the bloom of fire. He'd seen the math veteran pilots' lost aircraft destroyed, replacement rates mismatched. But he also saw a new tactical reality taking shape. American carriers would no longer fear concentrated strikes from carrier aircraft. They would fear the logistics of sustained island fighting, the human wave tactics on beaches, and the kamikaze that would come later like a new kind of weather. He turned to Vratu. "You did well, son. 9 confirmed yesterday. 9 is a number that changes histories." Vratu shrugged. "We did what we had to. But I keep thinking about their training fields. The kids we shot, their instructors are gone. The pipeline's broken." McCampbell tapped the blackboard. "Exactly. The pipeline is the kill ratio's deadliest enemy." He drew a line between production and frontline experience. "We can supply planes in numbers. They can't. That difference decides campaigns." Carrier air superiority meant the invasion of the Marianas could go forward with reduced risk from enemy air. It allowed Operation Forager to proceed. It allowed the U.S. Army Air Forces to plant B-29 bases within range of the Japanese home islands. It changed the calculus of the Pacific War from island to island into a runway-to-runway contest. Whoever could occupy the next string of islands could host the bomber that would make the final decisions. June 19th to 20 created openings that strategic planners would exploit for the remainder of 1944 and into 1945. But the cost calculus had a human face. Replacement pilots rushed through abbreviated training would soon find themselves facing hardened American KPs at higher altitudes, facing radar-controlled vectors that positioned Hellcats at the top of every engagement. Radar stations, carrier task force, synoptic plots, and fighter direction officers became more valuable than ever. Tactically, the U.S. Navy tightened cap altitudes and rendezvous procedures using radar fix and vectoring to force Japanese attackers into zones where Hellcats had altitude advantage, and the heavier Pratt & Whitney engines could deliver sustained fire. There were political ripples as well. SHAEF and Pacific Command Centers sent cables about industrial prioritization. The War Department fretted over allocation of aircraft versus ordnance versus shipping. Congress heard the headlines, 300 planes shot down in one day, and that image supported sustained funding. In the factories of the American heartland, the headlines were morale fuel. In the shipyards and plants, workers moved with the rhythm of purpose, building more Hellcats, more carriers escorts, more logistics ships. And yet, for those on deck and in the clouds, the moral ledger was personal and raw. Vratu and his comrades counted victories, but they also counted the faces in their sights. The Hellcat's reputation, rugged, survivable, brutal in firepower, was now the symbol of American dominance in the Pacific. But it also heralded a new phase of grinding island warfare, where air power would soften targets for bloody land operations. The pilots who had won the skies understood that their kills had made possible bloody sieges on the ground, a connection that sat uneasily beside the pride of survival. By late summer, as B-29 bases were made ready, and the Marianas came into Allied control, the consequences of June's air battle rippled outward in time and space. The Imperial Navy would never again mount a comparable carrier strike. Pilot training programs in Japan, already hamstrung by fuel shortages and bombing, were forced to shorten curricula and accelerate solo flights. The quality gap between American and Japanese pilots grew, and with it the strategic edge. But the Japanese response would be stubborn and catastrophic. The kamikaze would come to complicate the simple math of air superiority. A pilot willing to die makes replacement counts irrelevant for a single attack wave. He does not need training in formation flying. He needs only the courage to aim a plane like a spear. Thus, June's victory inevitably begat June's tragedy, a new kind of warfare where industrial might met fanatical sacrifice. That winter, when Alex Vraciu finally stood on American soil again, for leave the glow of parades and the sound of victory were tempered by distance. He returned home to letters and medals, to speeches, to handshakes with politicians who wanted to see the hero. Yet, when he closed the door of his small rental and sat alone with the newspaper that celebrated the turkey shoot, he kept thinking of a single line: air superiority wins battles, logistics, and will win wars. He kept a small scrap of gun camera film in his wallet, a flicker of smoke and a falling wing, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The sky had been won in June, but what followed would demand more than speed and fire. It would demand strategy, compassion, industry, and sacrifice multiplied on a scale unimaginable in peacetime. As the sun set on the Marianas that summer, the Pacific seemed to exhale. The Hellcats had flown their great arc across history, and for a moment, the world tilted toward a very particular end. But men on both sides of that ocean knew this truth with a painful clarity. Victories can be decisive, and yet the war they bring about can still be long, terrible, and costly in ways numbers cannot fully reveal. August-September 1944, the ocean had gone strangely still. No more the constant drone of aircraft engines or the chatter of machine gun fire echoing over the waves. Only the hum of generators, the creak of hull plates, and the sighing of the sea under a vast Pacific sky. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over, but its shadow stretched for months long after the last Zero fell flaming into the water. On the USS Lexington, the flight deck crews worked through the heavy heat of August. Paint blistered under the sun. Men wore nothing but khaki shorts and headsets, their skin browned and scarred from months of salt sweat and fire. Below the engines still thrummed the heartbeat of a fleet that refused to rest. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu leaned on the catwalk railing, helmet off, watching a new batch of pilots walk the deck in formation. They were kids barely out of flight school, nervous, wide-eyed. Their Hellcats gleamed factory new, their fuselages untouched by flak or fire. The veterans called them the Fresh Wings. One of the newcomers, Ensign Miller, approached Vraciu with a shy salute. "Sir, is it true you shot down 6 planes in one mission?" Vraciu smiled thinly. "That's what they say. But don't chase records, Ensign. Chase survival." "Yes, sir. Remember this, the enemy's not just in the air anymore. He's in the sea, the jungle, the fog. Keep your head, keep your wingman, and don't ever think you're safe." The boy nodded, swallowed hard, and jogged off. Vraciu watched him go, the memory of his own first flight still sharp behind his eyes, the smell of cordite, the tremor of recoil, the sight of a rising sun bursting into smoke. A week later, a courier plane delivered official reports from the Office of Naval Intelligence. The figures were staggering: over 476 Japanese aircraft destroyed during the June battle, most by Hellcats. The U.S. lost fewer than 130. The ratio, nearly 19-1, was unprecedented in modern air warfare. Admiral Mitscher's quiet remark became legendary in the wardroom. "We've taken the wings off Japan." But for the pilots, there was no triumph in those numbers, only silence. Because behind every red sun painted on their fuselages was a man they'd never met. And behind every victory lay the knowledge that war didn't end when the enemy stopped fighting. It ended when you stopped remembering. In the hangar bay, mechanics overhauled the planes that had carried them through the turkey shoot. Oil-streaked engines gleamed under floodlights. Men joked half-heartedly about naming their next aircraft Turkey Dinner or Sky Plucker. The gallows humor helped keep the ghosts away. Parker wandered in with a mug of coffee, spotting Vraciu studying a Hellcat, with fresh bullet scars in its tail section. That yours was. She'll fly again. Parker took a sip. We all will until there's no sky left to fight for. Vratiu chuckled dryly. Or until there's nothing left to fight. They stood there for a while, listening to the clang of wrenches and the distant hiss of acetylene torches. Outside, the Pacific rolled on vast blue and indifferent. By late August, the fleet was already turning toward its next target, Leyte Gulf. New charts replaced the old ones in the navigation room. New pilots joined old squadrons. And in Washington, planners were already whispering about the inevitable Okinawa. And beyond that, Japan itself. The lessons of the Philippine Sea were printed into manuals: radar intercept coordination, combat air patrol layering, fighter direction officer training. Hellcat doctrine had become industrial science. But the men who'd lived it, the ones who'd heard the scream of diving planes, who'd seen the ocean littered with burning wrecks, carried lessons that couldn't be diagrammed. They'd seen how quickly the sky could shift from blue to fire. They'd learned that victory was not a feeling. It was a responsibility. In Tokyo, Admiral Soemu Toyota reviewed what little remained of Japan's carrier air arm. Half-empty hangars, training schools without fuel, pilots learning tactics with wooden mock-ups instead of aircraft. The empire that had once soared over the Pacific was now grounded, its wings clipped by attrition and exhaustion. When he read the report on June's battle, over 300 aircraft lost in a single day, Toyota's hand trembled. He set the paper down and whispered, "It was never their machines we underestimated. It was their factories." They watched the horizon where the next war waited, the one of islands, caves, and fanatics. McCampbell broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what comes after?" Parker shrugged. "After what? After we win." Vratiu smirked faintly. "We'll find something else to fight. Men like us always do." The wind tugged at their uniforms, carrying the salt of the sea and the echo of distant thunderstorms rolling across the endless water. As darkness fell, the fleet prepared to move again. Engines rumbled to life. Signal lamps blinked across the water. And somewhere in the night, a pilot wrote in his logbook, June 19 to 20, 1944, "The sky over the Marianas was on fire. The enemy came in waves and we burned them from the sky." They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But to those of us who were there, it was the day the world learned what air supremacy really costs. The fleet turned toward another sunrise, toward another battle, toward another chapter in a war that still had no mercy to spare.